François Ravaillac stepped in front of King Henry IV of France's carriage on a narrow street in Paris on May 14, 1610, drove a knife between the king's ribs twice, and ended the reign of the monarch who had just united a country torn apart by 4 decades of religious war. Contemporary court records describe an assassination so precise, so instantaneous, that Henry's own guards had no chance to react before the second blow landed. The French historian Roland Musnier, whose exhaustive study of the killing remains the standard reference nearly 4 centuries later, called it the single act of political violence that most decisively altered the course of early modern Europe, severing a fragile peace before it could take root. Ravaillac claimed he acted alone, guided by visions rather than conspiracy, though the court that tried him was never entirely convinced. He was executed within days, torn apart by 4 horses in the Place de Grève, while a crowd that had once cheered his victim's coronation watched in silence. Balthasar Gérard entered the service of the Spanish crown in 1584, not as a soldier but as a devout young Catholic convinced that removing one man could save an empire. For 2 years he circled the household of William of Orange, the leader of the Dutch revolt, working his way close enough to be trusted with messages and errands inside the prince's own residence in Delft. On the 10th of July 1584 he asked for an audience under the pretext of business, waited until William turned to leave the room, and fired a pistol loaded with 3 bullets at point-blank range into the prince's chest, close enough that witnesses later testified they could smell the burnt wool of his doublet. The contemporary chronicler Emmanuel van Meteren, writing within years of the killing, recorded that William's last words were a plea for God's mercy on his soul and on his people, spoken as he collapsed on the staircase. Gérard did not run. He was captured within the hour, and the trial that followed produced one of the earliest state-sanctioned tortures on record, a punishment so prolonged that the presiding magistrates themselves noted its severity in the surviving court transcripts. He died 5 days later, having never once expressed regret. Gavrilo Princip was 19 years old when he joined the Serbian nationalist cell known as the Black Hand in 1913, trained in secrecy for a single purpose that even his own commanders debated whether he could carry out. On the 28th of June 1914 in Sarajevo, his first opportunity failed when a fellow conspirator's grenade missed its target and the royal motorcade sped away. By pure accident, Archduke Franz Ferdinand's driver took a wrong turn onto a side street later that same afternoon and stalled the car directly in front of the delicatessen, where Princip happened to be standing. He stepped forward, drew a pistol, and fired twice from less than 5 feet away, killing the Archduke and his wife Sophie within minutes of each other in the back of the open carriage. The Austrian court transcripts from his trial preserved in full record Princip's own flat admission that he had aimed deliberately and understood exactly what the killing would set in motion. Within 5 weeks, the alliances that bound Europe's empires together turned that single gunshot into a continental war that would kill nearly 17 million people. Princip never reached the gallows. He was too young under Austrian law to be executed and died in prison of tuberculosis in 1918, months before the war his bullet started finally ended. The death of Britannicus at a Roman banquet in the year 55 has never produced a single agreed-upon killer, and that uncertainty is precisely what makes the case endure. The Roman historian Tacitus, writing decades later in the Annals, states plainly that the young stepbrother of Emperor Nero collapsed and died within moments of tasting his food, poison Tacitus claims, on Nero's direct order, delivered by a woman named Locusta, who specialized in preparing substances that left no visible trace. Yet the historian Suetonius, working from different court sources, offers a slightly different account of who mixed the poison and who tested it beforehand, and neither writer was present in the room. Some modern scholars have argued the symptoms Tacitus describes, a sudden seizure followed by discoloration of the skin, are more consistent with epilepsy than with any poison known to Roman apothecaries. Others maintain that the timing alone, days before Britannicus was due to come of age and threaten Nero's claim to the throne, is too convenient to be coincidence. No physician's report survives. No confession was ever recorded. The most economical explanation remains that Nero ordered the killing to eliminate a rival before that rival could gather allies, but historians have argued the specifics of the poisoning, and even whether it was poison at all, for nearly 2,000 years without resolution. Charlotte Corday was not a soldier, not a spy, not trained in any of the arts of political killing. She was a minor noblewoman from Normandy who had spent most of her 24 years reading in a convent library, and by every account of those who knew her, she was quiet, unremarkable, the kind of person no one in Paris would have looked at twice. In July of 1793, horrified by the mass executions being carried out under Jean-Paul Marat's influence during the Terror, she traveled alone to Paris, purchased a kitchen knife from a shop near the Palais Royal, and requested a private audience with Marat under the pretense of naming enemies of the revolution. He received her while soaking in a medicinal bath, the only position that eased the skin disease that had confined him for weeks. She stabbed him once directly through the chest, and he was dead within minutes, according to the testimony of his companion Simone Everard, who found him collapsed in the water. Corday made no attempt to flee. She was arrested where she stood, tried within 4 days and executed by guillotine on the 17th of July, having told the tribunal that she killed one man to save 100,000. History remembers her as neither purely villain nor purely hero, only as proof that conviction alone can turn the most ordinary hands lethal. For decades, the death of Georgi Markov was treated as a strange footnote of Cold War history rather than the meticulously engineered political assassination it actually was. The public story, repeated in newspapers for years after his death in London in September 1978, was that the Bulgarian dissident writer simply fell ill at a bus stop near Waterloo Bridge, felt a sharp sting in his leg, and died of a fever 4 days later, his death written off by many as coincidence or unexplained illness. That version held until forensic pathologists re-examined the case years later and recovered a tiny platinum pellet, barely larger than a pinhead, lodged in the tissue of his thigh, drilled with microscopic holes designed to release a lethal dose of ricin directly into his bloodstream. The device had been fired from a modified umbrella and declassified files released by Bulgarian and British intelligence services in the years since have confirmed what investigators suspected, but could never initially prove. The operation was ordered by the Bulgarian Secret Service with direct assistance from the KGB, targeting Markov specifically for his broadcasts criticizing the regime he had fled. The historian Christopher Naring, whose access to the newly opened Bulgarian state archives reshaped the case in the 2010 seconds, established the full chain of command behind the killing, something no journalist or investigator had been able to document at the time. What had been dismissed as an eccentric urban legend, a man killed by an umbrella, was in fact one of the most sophisticated state assassinations of the 20th century, hidden in plain sight for over 30 years. From a Parisian street to a Roman banquet hall, from a convent-raised noblewoman to a poisoned umbrella tip in London, these 5 deaths reveal the same uncomfortable truth: the most powerful courts in history were never brought down by armies at their gates, but by a single person willing to get close enough to strike. Power, it turns out, has always been more vulnerable to proximity than to force. If this journey through history's most consequential killings taught you something you didn't expect, make sure to leave a like and drop a comment below telling us which assassin on this list shocked you the most. Subscribe if you'd like to see a part 2, because these 5 are only the beginning of a much longer, much darker list. Blades may fall silent and poisons may fade from memory, but history never forgets the hand that changed its course. Thank you for watching, and until next time, stay curious.